Hello and welcome back to IME 239, Introduction to Activity-Based Costing Part 2. So the way we ended our last video was I had just finished discussing this chart here where we define what the process is, and I said we were baking cakes. The activities were baking and frosting, so we were going to establish those cost pools are almost always driven by, established based on what the activity is. We allocated our overhead costs, our indirect costs, into the cost pools of baking and frosting, identified that machine hours and direct labor hours were what drove baking and frosting costs into the product directly, and then calculated a rate and developed a product cost for a cake. So just talked about it in general. Now let's move through and go through an actual example with some information in it. So here we have our cost pools, baking and frosting. You can see that the total cost pool for baking is $81,000. The total cost pool for frosting is $27,500, and that adds up to a total of $108,500. And these are the types of overhead costs or indirect costs that go into making the product, making a cake in this example. So we have purchasing as one of our overhead costs, and what I've decided is after some analysis, and this takes time and effort and thought as well, but we're just kind of jumping to it here, but after some analysis of what drives the purchasing agent's activities, we see that the dollar of money, the dollar amount we spend on raw materials is what drives their activity. So we're going to say whatever the dollar amount is of raw materials that goes into baking, that's the percent of the raw material of the purchasing agent's labor costs and any other overhead supplies they have that will go into the baking cost pool. So the total purchasing cost is $13,000, and based on the raw material dollar spend, $10,000 of that goes into baking and $3,000 of that goes into frosting. Now I want to highlight this is not the raw material cost. This is not the raw material cost because that would be direct cost. This is the indirect cost associated with procuring the material, getting it to the site, maybe storing it, inventory related type of things. Okay. Then our next type of overhead cost or indirect cost is hiring within human resources. And so I've done some analysis on that, and it looks like that how many people are hired is what drives the cost of human resources. So the number of people we need in human resources, the background checks, the compensation analysis, all that kind of stuff happening. And so frosting has more people, so they get a bigger portion of the human resource cost. So the total human resource cost for hiring is $15,000. $10,000 goes to frosting, $5,000 goes to baking. Then next we have human resource training, and so we've looked at that and decided that the number of hours that people spend in training is what drives that cost, because that drives the development of the material, the rental of the room, the materials that are used during training, all that sort of thing. And so we're saying that frosting has more training hours. More people are trained in frosting than are trained in baking, or more hours are spent training people in frosting than in baking. And then next we have capital equipment, and here we're going to allocate the cost by equipment type. So if I buy an oven, that obviously, if I buy an oven, that goes towards baking. If I buy a mixer or some tool to help make flowers or the decoration better on frosting or easier, then that's going to go in frosting. So that's by equipment type. Where the equipment used is where the dollars for the equipment will go. And then I have utilities, and so we've done analysis of utilities, and it seems like that the ovens are the biggest consumer of our utilities, heating them up, cooling them down, making sure we have to have air conditioning in the bakery so that the people have a comfortable environment to work in, etc. So the vast majority of utility costs are going to go to baking, with just a small portion going to frosting, meaning that frosting consumes less of the utilities, uses less of the utilities than baking does. Lastly, in our indirect costs here, we have maintenance. And so we've done some analysis there and said that the number of hours that the technicians spend on maintenance is how we're going to allocate it. So they spend many more hours in baking, maintaining the baking equipment than they do the frosting equipment. So therefore, a higher allocation goes to baking. So you can see we have our activities, we developed our activity cost pools, and we've taken our resource costs, our indirect or overhead costs, and allocated them into our activity pools. So now we see that of the full $108,000, $8,500, $81,000 is driven by baking or consumed by baking is what drives those costs. $27,500 is the cost that frosting consumes or uses. So let's go down here to the bottom and look at total cakes made and how we would allocate this overhead based on a traditional method, which is what we've done over the last couple of weeks, right? So again, remember, direct material and direct labor are allocated exactly the same way, whether we're looking at traditional or ABC. The overhead is what's different. So in overhead, in traditional, we typically allocate it based on number of units or total direct labor hours, and it's just a general big overhead pool, like we've got here, this full 108,000. We don't look to see what activity is driving that overhead cost. So we have the full 108,000, and we're going to say that for traditional in this example that we would allocate those overhead costs based on number of units. So if we have a forecast of 15 cakes for the quarter, and we have 13 weeks in a quarter, then that says that there's 195 cakes that we're going to build or make during the quarter. And all of these are projections. The activity levels are projections, the costs are projections, and that's the case in traditional as well as activity-based costing. So if I take $108,500 divided by 195 cakes, that says that every cake I make will get $556.41 of overhead allocated to it. All right? Seems like a pretty expensive cake, but we're a high-end bakery. Okay, so let's now look at activity-based costing. So I already went through how we developed our overhead pools for the activity. So overhead pool for baking, overhead cost pool for frosting. And so same thing, how many hours do I spend baking in the quarter? So based on these same 15 cakes, it's 390 hours of baking. Based on these same 15 cakes, it's 520 direct labor hours of frosting. So these are machine hours for baking, labor hours for frosting. And that's built up obviously dependent on what type of product we're making. So it might be a bundt cake that has no decorations whatsoever, all the way to a wedding cake for Madonna or something like that. It's going to be super fancy, super big, super complex. So we have our activity for each pool. Then we develop the cost pool rate. So it's just the $81,000 for the pool divided by 390 machine hours tells us that we're going to charge $207.69 per baking hour to the cake, to the product. And for frosting, we have $27,500 of overhead of indirect resources used to support frosting, to make frosting happen, divided by 520 hours of frosting, tells us that we have a cost pool rate here of $52.88. So for every hour we spend on frosting a cake, it will get $52.88 worth of overhead. So now let's look at an actual product. So we have our rates for our pools. What is our product cost going to be? Because that's really what our end example or end goal is, right, to understand the cost of the product. So we have one example here. We have a sheet cake with no decorations whatsoever. It's very simple, just single layer. It takes 1 hour of baking and a half an hour of frosting. So that total product cost is $234. I'm not going to talk cents anymore. I'm just going to round. $234. And how that was calculated is we have 1 hour of baking of an hour per cake times the $207.69 per hour of machine cost, plus the half an hour of frosting times direct labor hours of frosting times $52.88 per hour. And so that multiplies out and adds together to be $234. So this sheet cake that has no decorations is going to get overhead of $234 plus the direct material plus the direct labor would be the total product cost, but this is just the product overhead cost. Then let's look at the one that is a little more complex. So we have multi-layers and we have very intricate decorations. So it's going to take 2 hours to bake it, so and then 4 hours to frost it, 2 machine hours to bake it, so 2 hours in the oven, and 4 direct labor hours, 4 hours of someone working on the decorations and the frosting. So 2 hours per cake, 2 machine hours per cake, times the $208, again I'm rounding, per hour per machine hour is the cost, plus 4 hours per cake of direct labor frosting it, times $52.88 of direct labor per hour overhead that's going to be applied to it, tells us that the overhead applied to the more complex cake is going to be $627. So you can see that that probably gives you a better indication of how much the product actually costs, meaning the resources it actually consumes, versus just a blanket application of the overhead. So now we can be making decisions understanding what the true product cost is. For example, if I sell the sheet cake for $300, then I'm making money, right? Because I sell it for $300, let's assume this is total product cost, and it cost me $234. If I sell the fancy cake for $500, then I'm obviously not making money, right? And I would need to revisit that. So how to cut down on the frosting hours, how to reduce the baking hours, etc. So it drives much better decision making for the managers in the company. So that's our first example of activity-based costing. We'll go on to part 3 video of Introduction to ABC, and we'll go over pros and cons and another short example. All right, thank you.